Have you ever felt the cold breath of absolute despair pressing against your very soul in the dark? Imagine standing in a room where the only thing louder than your heartbeat is the sound of machines. For this family, the sterile walls of the hospital had become a prison of grief and silent, painful tears. The doctors had already delivered the final verdict, a sentence that felt like a heavy stone on their chests. There was no more medicine to give, no more surgeries to perform, and no more earthly hope left today. In this moment of total darkness, the boundary between our world and the eternal was about to thin out. Stay until the end, because the revelation at the conclusion of this story will change how you see life. The pediatric wing was a place where whispers carried more weight than the loud shouts of the busy world. A small boy lay in the center of the bed, looking far too tiny for the vastness of the sheets. His skin was the color of winter mist, and his breathing was a shallow, ragged struggle for every second. His mother sat nearby, her rosary beads clicking softly as she begged for a mercy that seemed so far. The lead physician watched from the nursing station, his heart hardened by years of seeing children fade away slowly. He knew the charts by heart, and the data told a story of a body that was simply giving up. He prepared his final notes, certain that the morning sun would not find this child still breathing here today. Despair has a way of silencing even the strongest voices and breaking the most resilient of human spirits. The father stood by the window, watching the city lights and wondering how the world could keep moving on. To him, it felt as if the universe was indifferent to the agonizing tragedy unfolding in that small, quiet room. Every prayer felt like it was hitting a ceiling of cold brass, never reaching the ears of a loving God. The monitors flickered with declining numbers, a digital countdown toward a moment they all feared would come soon. There was a sense that the story was over, that the final chapter had already been written in cold ink. If this story touches your heart, leave a like, as we prepare to enter the moment the miracle began. Then, the door opened with a sound so soft, it was almost like the brushing of an angel's wing. A woman who volunteered at the local parish entered, carrying a small satchel and a look of deep peace. She did not come with medical advice or empty words of comfort that had failed the family before now. Instead, she brought a story of a young boy from Italy who loved the Eucharist and the digital world. She spoke of Carlo Acutis, a teenager who had offered his own suffering for the sake of the church. The mother looked up, a tiny spark of curiosity flickering in the depths of her tired and hollow eyes. She felt a strange warmth suddenly enter the room, a presence that was both youthful and incredibly powerful today. The volunteer reached into her bag and pulled out a small, framed relic that contained a piece of cloth. She explained that this was a physical connection to a young man who was now standing before the throne. The doctor, seeing this from the hallway, shook his head at what he considered to be a hollow superstition. He believed in molecules, in white blood cells, and in the undeniable reality of a failing, tired organ system. He did not believe that a piece of fabric could do what his million-dollar machines had failed to achieve. Yet he found himself unable to turn away, drawn by a gravity that defied his scientific and logical mind. The air in the room began to vibrate with a frequency that felt like the humming of a distant star. The mother reached out and took the relic, holding it against her chest as she closed her eyes tightly. She didn't ask for a specific sign. She simply asked for the strength to endure the coming dark hours. As she prayed, she felt a pulse of energy travel from the relic through her arm and into her heart. It was not a cold sensation, but a burning, living heat that made her breath catch in her dry throat. She stood up and moved toward her son, guided by an invisible hand that seemed to steady her shaking legs. The volunteer nodded slowly, her face glowing with the certainty of someone who has seen the divine at work. Subscribe so you don't miss stories like this, because what happened when she touched him is truly beyond explanation. The mother leaned over the bed, her shadow falling across the pale and motionless face of her precious son. She held the relic of Carlo Acutis in her trembling hand, feeling its warmth grow stronger with every second. Slowly, she lowered her arm until the relic made direct contact with the child's cold and fragile chest today. She didn't know that at that exact moment, thousands of miles away, people were praying for his young soul. A sudden, brilliant flash of light seemed to dance behind her closed eyelids, though the room remained dimly lit. It was a touch that carried the weight of eternity, a bridge connecting a modern saint to a dying child. Comment if this message spoke to you as we witness the power of a faith that never truly dies. The heart monitor, which had been emitting a slow and agonizingly weak rhythm, suddenly spiked with intense energy. The jagged lines on the screen transformed into a vibrant, healthy green that moved with a newfound strength. The doctor rushed back into the room, his eyes scanning the equipment for what he assumed was a technical failure. He checked the sensors, the wires, and the power supply, convinced that the machine was simply giving a false reading. But as he looked down at the patient, he saw something that no medical textbook could ever adequately explain. The boy's skin was no longer the color of ash, but was flushing with a healthy, warm pink hue. His chest began to rise and fall with deep, steady breaths that signaled a body returning to full life. The skeptic physician reached out to touch the boy's forehead, expecting the burning fever that had reigned there. Instead, he felt a temperature that was perfectly normal, as if the infection had never even existed at all. He looked at the mother, who was still holding the relic against the boy's heart with a fierce intensity. He felt a strange, tingling sensation in his own fingers, a static charge that seemed to fill the entire space. There was no logical reason for a multi-organ failure to reverse itself in the span of a single heartbeat. He stepped back, his mind racing through every possible medical theory, but finding absolutely nothing that fit the facts. If this story touches you, leave a like, for we are standing in the presence of a true miracle. The silence of the room was broken by a soft, melodic sound that seemed to come from the child's lips. It wasn't a cry of pain or a moan of distress, but a gentle sigh of profound and peaceful relief. The boy's eyes began to move rapidly beneath his lids, as if he were watching a beautiful film playing. The mother whispered Carlo's name over and over, her voice a mixture of desperate gratitude and holy awe now. She could feel the life flowing back into her son's limbs, a literal resurrection happening beneath her very own hands. The volunteer stood in the corner, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as she continued her silent, rhythmic prayer. She knew that the young boy from London, who loved computers and the Virgin Mary, was present in that room. The nurse who had been assigned to the boy's care for the night walked in and nearly dropped her tray. She had seen many things in her 20 years of service, but she had never seen a terminal case turn. She looked at the oxygen saturation levels on the monitor and saw a perfect number staring back at her. The child's blood pressure, which had been dangerously low, was now that of a healthy and strong athlete. She looked at the doctor, seeking some kind of professional explanation for what was happening before her very eyes. But the doctor could only stare in silence, his mouth slightly open as he witnessed the impossible taking place. Stay until the end, because what the child said when he finally woke up will leave you completely speechless. Every person in that room felt as though they were no longer in a hospital, but in a sacred cathedral. The cold, metallic smell of medicine was replaced by a faint, sweet fragrance of lilies that appeared from nowhere. It was the odor of sanctity, a sign that the heavens had opened to intercede for this one small life. The mother finally pulled the relic away and tucked it safely into the boy's small pajama pocket for later. She knew the battle was won, not by the strength of men, but by the love of a saint. The boy's hand suddenly twitched, and his fingers reached out to find his mother's familiar and waiting grip today. The miracle of the touch was complete, but the revelation of the message was only just beginning to unfold. The boy's eyelids fluttered like the wings of a butterfly struggling to emerge from a long and dark winter. When he finally opened them, his gaze was not hazy or confused, but startlingly clear and filled with light. He did not look like a patient who had been hovering at the gates of death just a few moments before. He looked at his mother and smiled, an expression so bright it seemed to illuminate the entire hospital room. The mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she tried to contain a scream of pure, ecstatic joy. She saw in his eyes a depth of peace that didn't belong to a child, but to someone who had seen heaven. Subscribe so you don't miss stories like this, because the journey into the unknown is just starting now. The lead doctor stepped forward, his hands trembling as he performed a quick and urgent neurological exam on the boy. He asked the child simple questions, expecting slow responses or signs of severe cognitive damage from the long coma. Instead, the boy answered with a voice that was firm, clear, and filled with a strange, melodic kind of wisdom. He spoke of things that a child of his age should not know, using words that sounded like ancient, holy poetry. The doctor's clinical detachment began to crumble, replaced by a raw and terrifying sense of profound human wonder. He realized he was no longer looking at a medical case, but at a living, breathing defiance of every scientific law. There was a void in his understanding where logic used to sit, and he found himself unable to bridge that gap. The nurse began to record the vital signs, her pen shaking against the paper as she noted the impossible numbers. Every organ system that had been failing was now functioning with the precision of a perfectly tuned instrument today. The inflammation that had threatened to shut down his brain had vanished as if it had never existed in him. The medical team gathered in the hallway, their voices hushed as they debated the possibility of a massive misdiagnosis. But they all knew the truth. They had seen the scans, the blood work, and the undeniable decay of the previous days. They were looking for a physical cause for a spiritual event, a search that was proving to be entirely futile. If this story touches you, leave a like, for we are witnesses to a mystery that has no earthly name. The boy sat up in the bed, reaching for a glass of water, with a coordination that was simply miraculous. He looked at the doctor and told him not to be afraid of the things that he could not see or measure. The doctor froze, wondering how this child could sense the inner turmoil and the cold fear gripping his heart. The boy explained that while he was asleep, a young man with a glowing screen had shown him a path. He described a world where there was no pain, no hospitals, and no need for the heavy machines in the room. The mother listened, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird seeking a way to fly toward God. She knew the young man was Carlo, and she knew her son had been sent back with a specific message. In the nursing station, the atmosphere had shifted from professional routine to a state of absolute and total awe. Staff from other floors began to drift toward the pediatric wing, drawn by the whispers of a resurrection in room 4. They stood in the shadows of the corridor, watching as the child who was supposed to die began to laugh. It was a sound of pure life, a vibration that seemed to heal the very walls of the cold and sterile building. The head of the hospital was called, a man of great prestige who demanded an immediate and thorough explanation. He looked at the charts, then at the child, and then at the relic that was still resting in the boy's pocket. He found himself unable to find the words to dismiss what was clearly a supernatural intervention in his ward. The skeptic doctor retreated to his office, closing the door and sitting in the heavy silence of his own doubt. He tried to write a report, but the words spontaneous remission felt like a lie that he couldn't bring himself to tell. He knew that spontaneous remission didn't happen in seconds, and it didn't come with a fragrance of fresh lilies. He looked at his medical degrees on the wall and realized they were just paper in the face of this reality. A new question began to burn in his mind, one that challenged everything he had ever believed about life and death. He wondered if the young Carlo Acutis was still in the room, watching him with those kind and digital-savvy eyes. Stay until the end, because the secret the boy whispered next would change this doctor's life forever. The child leaned forward, his small hands resting on the crisp white sheets that no longer smelled of sickness. He began to describe a vast digital landscape that looked like a city made of pure, pulsing light and glass. In this place, he said, he met a teenager who wore a red polo shirt and carried a glowing backpack. The young man didn't speak with his mouth, but his thoughts moved directly into the child's own resting mind. He told the boy that he had been chosen to return because his family's mission on Earth was not yet finished. The boy's voice was steady, lacking any of the typical hesitation or fear usually found in a small child. Comment if this message spoke to you, for the words of a child often hold the greatest of divine truths. The mother asked her son if the young man had given him a sign or a specific word for the world today. The boy nodded and said that Carlo wanted everyone to know that the Eucharist is the fastest way to heaven. He described how Carlo showed him a computer screen that displayed every single person currently praying in the world. Each prayer appeared as a tiny, brilliant spark of light that connected the earth to a much higher, brighter realm. The child said that Carlo spent his time organizing these lights so that no one's cry for help was ever lost. It was a modern image of a timeless truth, delivered through the simple and pure perspective of a recovered soul. If this story touches you, leave a like as we see how a modern saint uses the tools of our time. The head doctor returned to the room, bringing a specialist in neurology who had traveled from a distant city. They were determined to find a physical anomaly, perhaps a rare genetic mutation that explained the sudden repair. But as they examined the child, the boy looked at the specialist and told him about a lost sister he had. The specialist turned pale, dropping his stethoscope onto the floor as he gasped in a state of absolute shock. He had never told anyone in the hospital about the sister he had lost in a tragic accident 30 years ago. The boy said that Carlo was standing right next to her in the light and that she was finally at peace now. The professional walls of the specialist collapsed in an instant, replaced by a flood of long-repressed silent tears. The nurse, who had been skeptical, began to notice that her own chronic pain had suddenly and completely vanished. She had suffered from a back injury for years, a burden that made her long hospital shifts a constant agony. As she stood near the boy's bed, she felt a warmth radiating from the child that seemed to knit her bones together. She didn't say anything at first, afraid that the sensation was just a trick of her tired and hopeful mind. But when she bent down to pick up a fallen bandage, she moved with a fluidity she hadn't felt since youth. She realized that the miracle was not confined to the child, but was a tide of grace rising in the room. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because miracles are often meant to heal more than one person. In the hospital cafeteria, the story began to mutate into a legend, drawing the curious and the desperate alike. People began to gather in the lobby, holding candles and photos of their own sick loved ones, seeking a sign. The administration was worried about the chaos, but they couldn't find a reason to stop the growing wave of hope. They saw hardened security guards wiping their eyes and surgeons pausing in the halls to offer a quiet prayer. The Acutis effect was transforming the sterile clinical environment into a place of profound spiritual encounter today. It was as if a portal had been opened by the touch of a mother and the intercession of a young saint. The machines in the room were still recording data, but the doctors had stopped looking at them with any authority. The child asked for his favorite toy, a small car that he had not been able to hold for many months. He moved with a vigor that suggested he had never been bedridden or weakened by a terminal and cruel illness. He told his father that Carlo promised to visit the man in the basement, referring to a janitor who was ill. The father checked with the staff and found that a maintenance worker was indeed struggling in the lower level. It was another confirmation that the child's knowledge was not coming from any earthly or natural source today. The mystery was deepening, weaving together the lives of strangers through the invisible threads of a digital age saint. Stay until the end, because the final transformation of the hospital ward is something you truly have to hear. The father hurried to the hospital's lower levels, driven by the strange and specific words of his young son. He found the maintenance area, a place usually hidden away from the bright, clinical lights of the upper wards. There, in a small, cramped office, he found a janitor sitting with his head in his tired, weathered hands. The man looked up, his eyes filled with a weariness that spoke of a hidden, long-term struggle with his health. He admitted that he had been secretly battling a severe condition, telling no one for fear of losing his job. The father told him about the young man with the backpack and the promise of a special visit that night. Subscribe so you don't miss stories like this, because grace often finds those who are most hidden from the world. Back on the pediatric floor, the specialist who had heard about his sister was no longer the same person. He spent hours sitting by the boy's bed, not as a cold scientist, but as a man seeking a spiritual truth. He realized that his entire career had been focused on the how of life, while ignoring the why of existence. The boy told him that Carlo was fond of saying that we are all born as originals, but many die as copies. The doctor felt the weight of that statement, realizing how he had copied the cynicism of his own mentors for years. He decided in that moment that he would dedicate his future research to the connection between faith and healing. If this story touches you, leave a like as we witness the birth of a new purpose in a hardened heart. The hospital administration decided to call in a formal commission to document every single event from that week. They began interviewing the staff, the mother, and even the stranger who had brought the relic into the room. Every testimony matched perfectly, describing a sudden intense heat and a sense of profound, overwhelming peace. The digital records from the heart monitors were printed out and studied by engineers for any sign of a glitch. They found that the electrical surge recorded at the moment of the touch was impossible for a human body. It was as if the boy had been momentarily plugged into a source of power that surpassed all known physics. The investigators looked at each other in silence, knowing they were documenting a case that would defy the world. The news of the janitor's sudden and total recovery began to filter up through the hospital's many floors. He had walked out of his office that morning feeling as though 20 years of age had been lifted from him. He described a young man he met in the hallway who told him his work was seen and loved by the Creator. The description matched the others: the curly hair, the red shirt, and the aura of modern, youthful energy. The hospital chaplain, who had seen many deaths, said he had never seen a life force so contagious and strong. It was as if Carlo Acutis was walking the corridors, checking on every soul that had been forgotten or ignored. Comment if this message spoke to you, for no one is ever truly hidden from the eyes of a saint. The boy asked his mother to bring him a laptop, saying he wanted to see the website Carlo had built. As he scrolled through the descriptions of Eucharistic miracles, his face lit up with a knowing and deep familiarity. He pointed at the screen and said that he had seen those specific lights during his short time away from Earth. The mother watched her son, realizing that he was no longer just her child, but a living witness to a legacy. She felt a responsibility to share this story, not to gain fame, but to give hope to those in the dark. The miracle had transformed their private tragedy into a public message of enduring and vibrant hope for all today. Stay until the end, because the final conclusion and the message left for you is the most important part. The sun began to set on the final day of their stay, casting a golden glow over the entire pediatric wing. The child was officially cleared for discharge, a medical miracle that the hospital could not officially explain or label. As they walked toward the exit, the staff lined the hallway, not in a professional goodbye, but in a silent tribute. They saw in that family the possibility of something greater than the cold, hard walls of their daily reality. The skeptic doctor stood at the end of the line, no longer looking at his watch or his clipboard of notes. He nodded to the mother, a silent acknowledgement that he had finally learned more than he could ever teach. The car drove away, but the atmosphere in the hospital remained forever altered by the touch of a young saint. The family returned home to a house that felt different, as if the very walls were breathing with a new life. The boy's room, once a place of quiet preparation for a tragic end, was now filled with laughter and play. He continued to speak of Carlo, not as a distant figure from a book, but as a friend who was always near. The mother noticed that whenever the boy prayed, the same fragrance of lilies would softly fill the morning air. She realized that the miracle was not a one-time event, but a continuous spring of grace for their entire community. They began to share their story with neighbors, and slowly the ripples of hope began to change the whole town. If this story touched your heart, leave a like as we celebrate the victory of life over the shadow of death. The skeptic doctor eventually left his prestigious position at the hospital to open a clinic for the poor. He kept a small picture of Carlo Acutis on his desk, a reminder of the day his logic was finally humbled. He often told his patients that while he could prescribe medicine, he could not prescribe the will to live. He had learned that the most powerful healing occurs when the soul is finally at peace with its divine creator. His colleagues often asked him what had changed in his heart during those 3 mysterious days in the ward. He would simply smile and point to the image of the boy with the backpack and the digital holy eyes. He had become a bridge between the world of science and the world of the spirit, a true man of healing. The hospital commission finally released its report, labeling the events as medically inexplicable in their final draft. It was a rare admission from a world that usually demands a natural cause for every single physical effect. The files were sent to Rome, adding to the growing mountain of evidence regarding the intercession of young Carlo. But for the family, the paperwork mattered much less than the sight of their son running through the green grass. They knew that their lives were now a living testament to the reality of the highway to heaven Carlo spoke of. They committed themselves to the Eucharist, finding in the bread of life the same warmth they felt in the ward. Comment if this message spoke to you, for we are all traveling on this same digital and spiritual highway. Years have passed, but the story of the touch that defied science continues to be told in hushed, reverent tones. The boy grew into a young man with a deep sense of purpose, often helping others navigate their own dark valleys. He never forgot the light he saw or the feeling of the relic against his chest in that cold hospital room. He tells everyone that the greatest miracle is not the healing of the body, but the awakening of the soul's eyes. Carlo Acutis remains a beacon for the modern world, proving that sanctity is possible even in a world of screens. His life shows us that we can use the tools of man to build the kingdom of God right where we stand. Share this with someone who needs a miracle today, because hope is a gift that is meant to be passed on. As we conclude this journey, take a moment to look at your own life and the many unseen graces around you. Perhaps you are facing a wall that seems too high, or a diagnosis that feels like a final and dark sentence. Remember the child in room 4 and the young saint who reached across the veil to offer a warm, holy hand. Faith is not the absence of data, but the presence of a deeper truth that data simply cannot ever contain. Carlo Acutis is still interceding, still organizing the sparks of light, and still listening to every whispered prayer. You are never alone in your struggle, and you are never too far from the reach of a divine and loving touch. Subscribe so you don't miss stories like this, and may your heart be open to the wonders that are yet to come. The story of Carlo Acutis and the sick child is a reminder that the impossible is just a word used by men. In the realm of the spirit, Everything is possible to those who have the courage to believe and the heart to pray. May you walk your own path with the same joy that Carlo had, even in the face of your own difficult trials. Thank you for joining us in this reflection on the power of faith, the mystery of miracles, and the light of saints. Let this narrative be a seed in your heart that grows into a tree of hope for everyone you meet in your life. The digital saint is watching, the Eucharist is waiting, and the highway to heaven is open for you to travel today. May the peace of the Lord be with you always, and may your life be the next miracle that the world cannot explain.